As Molly said, my name's Emma Weaver. I'm the Deputy CEO of the ADHD Foundation Neurodiversity Charity. But my specialism, and I suppose my passion at the foundation, is helping people, families, professionals to understand ADHD and other neurodevelopmental conditions in the early years. The early years can be a little bit of a tricky time, really, to understand these conditions, purely because the children are so little and they're going through particular stages of child development where it can be difficult to define, is it typical child development or is it a child with potential ADHD, or what we refer to as emerging traits of ADHD. So what we're going to look at today is what ADHD looks like in our little ones. Now, we've got to be really mindful that I often say all 3-year-olds can often look like they've got ADHD. 3-year-olds are meant to be impulsive, they're meant to be hyperactive, and they're meant to be inattentive because of how they are growing and how they're developing. We're very used to seeing 3-year-olds climbing with loads of energy. We're very used to seeing 3-year-olds struggling to regulate their emotions. But if it's a 3-year-old with potential ADHD or neurodiversity, it's a 3-year-old that's maybe experiencing some of those traits to a greater extent than their peers. So I'm going to talk to you about that today and what we mean by a greater extent. So we'll talk about some of the characteristics. And before we get started, though, I just want to introduce you to our service at the foundation. So I've got a team, really lucky. They're a wonderful team. We're called the Neurodiversity in Early Years and Key Stage 1 service. We are based in Liverpool, but we provide support nationally. And our job really is to help people to understand neurodevelopmental conditions in children in the early years up until Key Stage 1. So typically age 8 and below. Now, our team, we've got a range of different skill sets. Some of our team members are teachers. We've got people from children's centres, play therapists, backgrounds. But we've created some materials that are free to access for anybody that wants to learn a little bit more. Now, those materials are available on our website, and our website is www.adhdfoundation.org.uk. Now, in the search bar, if you just type in neurodiversity in early years, this page, the page that will come up initially will be all pictures of the team and a little bit of information about our services and what we do. If you scroll to the very bottom, there will be a resources section. When you click on that button, it'll bring you to a page that looks a little bit like this. Now, on the resources section, we've got lots and lots of downloadable written material. So materials that you can print off, you can send it to nurseries, you can send it to other family members to help them understand. Or it might be that you just want to read it from your phone just to develop a little bit more understanding. So some of the topics centre around ADHD in young children, some centres around executive function development, which I'm going to introduce to you today. But we've got some other bits as well around encouraging early writing skills and what we refer to as fine motor skill development, which is sometimes an area of difficulty for some of our children with ADHD. So please feel free, have a little look at the resources, download them, send them to people. It's about helping people to understand what ADHD and other neurodevelopmental conditions look like in the early years. Now, as a charity, we work with the lifespan. So we work with little ones, but we also work with adults as well. So we've got access to other services too, which you can find on our website. But you also might want to follow us on Facebook. And if you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow us on there. And it'll help you just to keep on top of what we're doing as a charity. It also might be an opportunity to see some of the research that's happening, but also to learn more and more about neurodiversity. And what's going on in the world of neurodiversity, because there's a lot happening. It's quite an exciting place to be at the moment. So what are we going to look at in the next kind of 45 minutes? As Molly said, I want to make sure that we've got some time for questions at the end. So I will leave about 15 minutes towards the end. But before the questions, I'm going to just talk to you to begin with about early brain development. We can't talk about ADHD without talking about the brain. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition. Neuro is brain, developmental is how the brain has developed. So I'm going to talk to you about the importance of early intervention and why understanding ADHD in the early years is helpful, and intervention and support in the early years is particularly helpful because our children are going through a rapid period of brain growth where support can really help them and their future kind of projection of what their experiences could look like. I'm then going to break down what ADHD is. So we're going to look at the characteristics of ADHD, with a particular focus on what it might look like in our little ones. Then I want to talk to you about sensory integration, because sensory integration often is one of the key characteristics that we see in ADHD. We see it in all of the neurodevelopmental conditions, but I certainly see in lots of the nurseries that I visit and lots of the schools that I go to see children in, I see lots of children presenting with potential sensory integration differences. So I'm going to talk to you about that and some strategies, I suppose, some of the top tips that parents have talked to me about that have worked for their children. And then I want to talk to you about executive functioning. Executive functioning is the kind of planned part of the brain, how our brain interacts with the world, communicates and kind of plans and problem solves. So I'm going to talk to you about how people with ADHD have differences with their executive functions, but how we can support the development of those executive functions in the early years. So, early brain development. As I said to you, can't talk about ADHD without talking about the brain. ADHD is very much centered in what we call neuroscience. And neuroscience is the science of the brain. What all the research tells us is that we've got two sensitive periods of brain growth, one in the early years, and then we've got a second sensitive period, which is in the secondary years. Now, these sensitive periods are key because it's the times when the brain goes through a rapid period of growth. All the synaptic connections are linking up, and experiences, opportunities, and environments really help to strengthen the architecture and the growing brain, particularly in the early years, because 90% of a child's brain, the development of the human brain happens before the age of 7. Which I just think is amazing. This is why working in early years is the best job in the world, because we've got this window of opportunity. It's also why supporting children where we are potentially seeing emerging traits of neurodevelopmental conditions is really important, because while the brain is growing, if we can get strategies and supports in place, it can be really helpful for them and their future development. Now, if you imagine the human brain, it develops from the bottom up. And if you picture the human brain a little bit like a high five, the first part of the brain to develop is the brainstem. This develops in the womb. The brainstem is important, not only because it keeps us alive, it regulates our temperature and our heart rate, but the brainstem is also really important because it helps us with sensory integration. The world around us gives us information through our senses, and the first place for it to kind of come into the body is via the senses, and then it goes to the central nervous system and works with the brainstem. The next stage to develop, and this is what we call the cerebellum brain, which is the lower brain region. It's kind of here in the hand model. The cerebellum part of the brain starts to grow from birth and goes through a rapid period of growth up until around 2 years. All of these areas rapidly grow, but then they continue to mature as the human brain matures. The cerebellum area of growth is all to do with our sensory motor. So it's how our body moves and coordinates itself in space. In kind of day-to-day terms, it's the crawling stage of child development. For some children, not all children, but for some, we can sometimes see an early alert for neurodivergence at this stage of brain development. And an early alert might be a child who has a difficulty or has a different experience as they're developing those skills in crawling. So I've got lots of parents that I work with who have said to me that their child missed the crawling stage, or they didn't crawl for very long, they stood up very quickly. I had one dad not that long ago that said his little boy stood up really quick and just started running as a very, very little one. I've also had parents that have said things like their baby didn't do that classic crawl of one hand, one leg at the same time. They've seen like commando crawls or bum shuffles or babies rolling on carpets and not necessarily doing that coordinated crawl that we might see. Now, for some children, that can be an early alert for a neurodevelopmental condition. It can sometimes be an early alert for dyspraxia, but we also see this as an early alert for ADHD. Because what happens is if we miss that important stage of development, if we don't get lots of opportunity for that coordinated control of the body, we lose opportunities to develop something called proprioception. And proprioception is your body's sat-nav system. It's how your body coordinates itself in movement and space. If you've got weak proprioception, what that leads to is sometimes difficulties with sitting still for long periods of time. Walking, coordinating your walking, being able to have spatial awareness and visual perception of the environment around you. can be difficult if you have difficulties with your proprioceptive kind of sense. And when I get onto the sensory section of this webinar today, I'll talk to you about how you can enhance proprioceptive development, how you can support the development of that key area of physical development for our children. Then after the cerebellum, the next stage to develop is the limbic system. And the limbic system is the emotional part of the brain. It's the fight, flight or freeze. It's the part of our brain that's very primal. It goes through its period of growth from around 18 months to around 4 years. This is why we get the toddler tantrums. This is why we get, in a typically developing child, emotional dysregulation, a child whose behaviour and emotions aren't necessarily logical. Now, this is typical for children in the early years. All children are going through the stage of limbic brain growth around 3 to 4 years. So they're often emotionally dysregulated. They're struggling to understand their emotions and they're struggling to express their emotions. For a child with ADHD, what we might see at this stage of development is difficulties with their emotions to a greater extent than their peers. So difficulties regulating their emotions, managing their emotions. You might see more frequent experiences of emotional reactivity or emotional meltdowns or outbursts as well. And then the final stage to develop, this period of rapid growth starts at around the age of 3, rapid period of growth up until around the age of 7. But again, like all of the other areas, continues to mature as our children grow. It's called the cortical brain. And the cortical brain sits nice and neatly over the top of the lower brain regions. And the cortical brain houses what we call our executive functions. So this part of the brain is the learning brain. It helps us to plan, regulate our emotions, understand our environments around us, helps us to manage our impulse as well. Now, what we know from research, children with ADHD have a difficulty in the development of what we call the prefrontal cortex. So it's delayed, it's immature in its development, which means children with ADHD will often sit potentially for longer in the lower brain areas of development. So we might see a higher level of physical, sensory and emotional need and more difficulties with that planning, learning, socializing part of the brain. And this is why we need to have lots of supports in place for what we call lower brain region supports. So supports for emotions, supports for sensory and movement, but also why we need supports for the top part of the brain as well. Visual supports to help us to understand planning, problem solving, making sense of the world around us. And when I look at strategies, this will all hopefully fall into place with some of the strategies I introduce you to. So what is ADHD? ADHD comes under the umbrella of neurodivergence. Other neurodivergent conditions include the likes of autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. There's lots of them, but ADHD is one of them. And ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, unfortunately, right now, the title for ADHD is quite negative. We've got that word deficit in there, which suggests that a child with ADHD is potentially lacking in something. They're certainly not lacking in anything. We prefer to refer to it as a dysregulation. Children with ADHD can regulate their emotions. Children with ADHD do have the ability to regulate attentional control. They just need lots of support and lots of guidance, particularly in the early years, to be able to do that and to be able to regulate some of their big feelings, but also regulate kind of how they process information verbally, but also via the environment around them as well. We've then also got that word at the end, disordered. And for me, I really don't like the word disordered. I think it's really negative. We would prefer to refer to it as a condition rather than disordered. But I actually wonder whether over time the term ADHD will change. Because what I tend to find in my work is when I ask people what their understanding of ADHD is, they usually focus on the one area that they know the most about, which is hyperactivity. So lots of people will say, oh, if you've got ADHD, you're hyperactive, you're on the go all the time, you struggle to sit still. It's not always the case. Children with ADHD don't always have to have the hyperactive trait. There's something called inattentive ADHD, which is a child that doesn't have any of the hyperactive impulsive traits, but is struggling to sustain attention. Now, these are the traits of ADHD. The first trait is hyperactivity. And hyperactivity is a child with high energy, really spontaneous, on the go all the time. What I tend to find in the early years is a hyperactive child in the early years is often a little one that does lots of movement, lots of climbing. When I go into early years settings here in Liverpool, I'm often talking to early years practitioners, and usually they're telling me that the child has this need to climb, or this need to kind of feel their body. They like to be on the go and moving quite a lot. The reason for that, movement helps to develop proprioception, but movement also helps us to regulate what we call dopamine. Children with ADHD have a dysregulation of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that moves around the brain and moves around the body. And dopamine helps us to manage our kind of movement, our behaviour. It also helps us to regulate our concentration and attentional control. Children with ADHD need to move in order to regulate dopamine, in order to help them with those skills. So what hyperactivity might look like in your household is a child just with high energy, struggles to settle, and is just kind of either very, very chatty or very, very physical, lots and lots of movement. You've then got the second trait of ADHD, which is impulsivity. Now, impulsivity in the early years is often a child who behaves before thinking. So it might look like risk-taking behaviours, but impulsivity is also a child that might struggle to sustain attention for long periods of time. So I tend to find families will say they struggle to sit still doing an activity for any longer than a couple of minutes. They're on to the next, on to the next, on to the next. It's kind of, that's done, I'm moving on to the next thing. Once that's done, I'm moving on to the next thing. Impulsivity might also be a child that maybe struggles to stay in the moment and think about and maybe plan some of their coordination and their motor movements. So I sometimes see children who impulsive behaviours might be, they might be playing, and an impulsive action is just to throw something that they've got in their hand. Or an impulsive action when you're about to cross the road, rather than stopping and thinking about it, the impulsive action is to just run without putting the thought behind the next steps of that action. Now, like I said earlier on, hyperactivity and impulsivity is common in all children in the early years. We call it inhibitory control. Children in the early years are still developing inhibitory control at around the age of 3 and 4. When we look at inhibitory control in ADHD, like I've referred to before, we have to think about it in comparison to their peers. So is the risk-taking behaviour that we're seeing more significant than another child in their nursery, or when you've taken them to parties? Does that behaviour look more significant in your child than it does to another child? And then you've got the final trait of ADHD, which is inattention. And inattention is basically difficulty with storing and remembering information. What this might look like in the early years is a child where you feel like you're continuously repeating their name. It might feel like they're not listening to you. Sometimes the first assessment that happens for a child with ADHD is a hearing test, because parents will say things like, I don't think he can hear me. I say his name repeatedly, I give him verbal instructions and he doesn't respond to them. The reason we do that hearing test is to work out whether there are any hearing difficulties. If there aren't, that's when we then look at this inattentive element trait of ADHD. For some children, they have difficulties with processing verbal instructions. It used to be, and it's very negative, and I'm glad we don't use this language now, but it used to be referred to as sluggish cognitive tempo. And sluggish cognitive tempo basically is slow processing of information. Some research tells us for children with ADHD, it can sometimes take 10 seconds for them to hear an instruction, process it, and then do an action off the back of that instruction, which is why we've got to chunk our words, why pictures can be really helpful. You might have had somebody that's worked with you that suggested using pictures or suggested slowing down communication. All of that is because it helps with that processing speed and that processing time. Children who are also inattentive, they might also demonstrate at nursery. You might have early years practitioners saying that your child might learn something one day, you come to repeat the activity on day 2 and they've forgotten the information that they'd learned previous. Or a child with inattentive ADHD might be struggling to remember some of the routines and structures of the day. Now that might be at home, it might be the morning routine, it might be the same routine every single morning, but you're still having to remind them, you're still having to dress them and get them ready in the morning because they're struggling to retain the information. And that's because of something called our working memory. People with ADHD have a weakness in the working memory. And working memory basically is storing information on the go. Classic example of weak working memory is that moment when you're at home, you go up the stairs to go and get something, and when you get to the top of the stairs, you've completely forgotten what you've gone up for. That's a lapse in working memory. We can all have lapses in our working memory, but for people with ADHD, it happens on a more regular basis. Now, as I said, you don't have to have all 3 of the traits of ADHD to be diagnosed with the condition. We now have subtypes. The first subtype is predominantly hyperactive impulsive. So these are our children who are on the go, moving a lot, quite chatty, impulsive with their behaviours, but they're always paying attention. So these are the children that they might be walking around the house and they might be kind of outside, needing to be on the go all the time. But you ask them a question and they're able to give you a response, or they're able to remember something that's happened in that moment. You've then got the second subtype, which is the predominantly inattentive. Now, the predominantly inattentive subtype of ADHD is much harder to pick up. Particularly in the early years, it can be really difficult to spot the inattentive ADHD. But an inattentive child has less of the hyperactive impulsive traits, but higher levels of inattention. So these are the children that are struggling to remember, struggling to follow instructions and retain information. And then you've got the final trait of ADHD, or I suppose the final subtype, which is the combined. And the combined subtype is all 3 of those traits, all in the mix for a child. But as I said, we've got to be really mindful that in the early years, we see lots of these traits in our typically developing children. Hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention is very common because of how the brain is growing and how the brain is forming. So we have to hold that in mind. And that's often why when you see a health visitor, or if you're referred to a paediatrician, they often offer time. They want to wait for an assessment to see. One of the reasons for that is they're wanting to see how that kind of early child development takes place. But that's not to say that we wait for intervention. We often talk about in our early years service, we need to provide intervention for the presenting behaviour that we're seeing. So not because it's ADHD, because we are likely to not know that that's the case. But what we can do is to provide intervention for impulsivity or inattentive strategies, or supports for movement and sensory processing difficulties as well. Movement is the key to ADHD. We need to be able to support our children to move to help them to regulate their dopamine. Dopamine, when it moves and it flows well for a person with ADHD, they're able to tap into some of those concentration skills. They're able to tap in better to those executive functioning skills. Now, our little ones move all the time. So early years is a great time because even in our nursery settings, they're on the go because of what we call continuous provision. But at home, they're on the go as well. But some ideas of ways that we can support movement at home. We can support through fine motor skill movement. And fine motor skill movement is any activities where it's small hand movements. So Lego, kinetic sand, Play-Doh. I work with an amazing school and they use tweezers and Cheerios, and the children have to pick up the Cheerios with the tweezers. Now, if your child has ADHD, they might struggle with their fine motor skills. They might be struggling with early mark making. So if that's the case, things like big chunky chalks, we're coming into the summer months now where we can get outside, find a big pot of chunky chalks, getting your child to lie on their tummy and draw with the chunky chalks will really help fine motor skill development. And that can really support the development of proprioception, but it also aids opportunities for movement. Climbing is also great for our children with ADHD. Trampolines, going for walks, sometimes for some children, movement before bedtime can really help with the sleep routine, but not for all children. I've worked with some children where movement is unhelpful because some children from gross motor skill movement, which is those big movements like jumping or running, For some children, they get a dopamine high, which can lead to difficulties with calming them back down. If that's the case, that's where we focus on the fine motor skill movement, which is your small hand movement activities. So movement's really important. Lots of opportunities to enable your child to move will really, really help them to manage some of those ADHD traits. Particular movement, I suppose, that we really focus on. So something, again, it's helpful for all little ones, but if your little one is potentially has ADHD, doing activities with a focus on proprioception will be really helpful. Now, if you Google proprioceptive activities, you'll get loads of examples. You might want to Google proprioceptive activities at home, and they'll give you lots of web pages with information on there. But these are just some that I thought I'd introduce you to today. Heavy weighted activities are proprioceptive. So carrying heavy boxes, wheelbarrows outside with mud in, where a child's transporting the wheelbarrow from one end of the garden to the other end of the garden. If you're using obviously heavy weighted activities, make sure that they're not too heavy for your little one, but anything where a child's getting some of that physical feedback from the body. Climbing is a great way to develop proprioception as well. Feeling full body force. So if you've got a small climbing wall, climbing frames, getting them down to the local park, using monkey bars, anything like that can be really, really helpful. Climbing trees safely, really helpful. Pushing prams. I've got a little girl that I support at the moment, and she uses a pram, and they put heavy things in that pram, and the little one will just walk up and down, pushing the pram. When they're going to the shops, walking, that pram with a little bit of weight in it is really regulating, really helps the child to kind of manage some of those proprioceptive and physical demands that activity might have on them. It helps to develop proprioception, but it's really grounding as well. So it can really help our children to manage regulation and how they're feeling. But if you can get your child to do yoga as well, yoga is great for proprioceptive development as well. You know, this little boy on the bottom left there doing a plank is great because you're strengthening the core, which is really strengthening the key area that will really help with proprioceptive development. So they're just some ideas. Anything that is where the body feels the pressure. Resistance bands can be great as well. I'm working with a family at the moment. They've got resistance bands in the back garden. They've attached them to fence panels, and their little one will just go outside and pull the resistance bands. Will kind of put their body around the resistance bands. If you're using anything like that, just make sure that you've got that somebody's looking over them, that they're doing it with adult support, because the resistance bands can also ping. So just make sure that if they're using heavy weighted activities, if they're doing anything heavy weighted or anything with resistance bands, that they have an adult occupying and looking after them whilst they're using those activities too. So there's some proprioceptive activities that might be really helpful. Another thing that can be really useful is introducing sensory circuits to the home environment. Now, sensory circuits work on all of the areas that are really important for early child development. A sensory circuit has 3 phases to it. Each phase is as important as the next one. So we have to make sure that we do step 1, step 2, and step 3. Sensory circuits shouldn't take any longer than 20 minutes to begin with. The more you get used to it, it might take even less time. But a sensory circuit, essentially, it's like a mini assault course, but with certain focuses. Step 1 of your sensory circuit is your alert stage. So these are activities that are going to get the heart rate going, but activities that are going to focus particularly on forwards, backwards, and side-to-side movements. So bunny hops, star jumps, running on the spot, anything that's going to get the heart rate going, but going to get the head moving as well. Jumping up and down, trampoline jumps, jumping on a trampette can be great at this stage. Second stage of your sensory circuit is the organising stage. So this is the proprioceptive part now. So this is any activities that are cross-body. So I've got one child and he likes to walk over tyres. So he balances on tyres, he puts his feet in and out of tyres, balance beams, climbing walls, anything where a child's got to really think about what their body is doing. Where are my hands going? Where are my feet going? Where's my head? What's my head doing? That's the organising stage. And then the third stage is your calming stage. And these are your activities that bring the child back down. So these are activities that are going to be regulating. So one nursery that I work in, the children lie on their backs, they pull their knees up to their chests and they rock for a count of 10. One mum that I work with, she uses a blanket, a fleecy blanket, she wraps her little one up, sits the little one on her knee and squeezes her shoulders and rocks from side to side for counts of 10. If your child is able to and understands breathing techniques, you might want to do some breathing techniques at the end of your sensory circuit. What the feedback that we're getting from families that use sensory circuits is that it's really helping their child to regulate and manage some of the need for movement, but also manage some of the sensory integration differences that they might be seeing as well. So that's one that's worth a try. If you Google sensory circuits at home, you'll see some really lovely examples of how to use a sensory circuit in the home environment. And sometimes it's nice to see it on a video to see it in action too. So when we talk about sensory circuits, we also need to reflect on our sensory system. When we looked at the human brain, the sensory system plays a huge part in early child development. We are developing our senses from the moment of conception. So when the brainstem starts to grow in the womb, that's when our sensory environment becomes really important. Our sensory experiences help us to develop the human brain. It helps, I suppose our senses are the foundations of how our brain grows. Now, for children with neurodevelopmental conditions, we might see difficulties with the development of senses, or what we refer to as sensory integration. Sensory integration is how we take information in from the environment around us and how we make sense of it. So we've got 8 senses. We've got sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. They're the 5 senses that we often talk about. We know about them. But we've got 3 additional senses. And these 3 senses we don't talk as much about, but these 3 senses are probably the most important ones for us to recognise in the early years. Because I often see these 3 senses as the foundations of our sensory development. The first one is proprioception, which is your sat nav, which is what I've spoken about. You've also got the vestibular system, and the vestibular system is your body's spirit level. So that's how your body coordinates its balance. It's how it understands its directional control. So it's how our bodies know whether we're forwards, backwards, or side to side, or upside down. And then you've got the interoceptive sense, which is the sense of your internal world. So that's your emotions. But that's also your knowing when you need to go to the toilet. It's also knowing when you're hungry or not hungry. For some children with sensory integration differences, they experience their senses differently. For some children, they might experience their senses to a heightened degree. We call this hypersensitivity. If you're hypersensitive, it means that you are acutely aware or you really experience that sense to a greater extent. So a child who is particularly sensitive to sound, these are our children whose hands go up to their ears. Children who are particularly sensitive to taste, they might be children who need to have bland diets. I work with lots of little ones that are very particular about what foods they eat. They'll often eat the same thing, and usually it's beige. Lots of families say I can only, chicken nuggets and chips are the only thing that they'll eat, or a piece of bread with a little bit of butter on. Lots of families struggling with restrictive diets. Now that's often linked to sensory integration differences. Also, if a child is hypersensitive to their interoceptive sense, they might feel their emotions to a greater extent than somebody else. So that's one end of the sensory spectrum. We've then got the other end, which is what we call hyposensitivity. A child that's hyposensitive might not be getting the sensory feedback from all of the senses. So what that leads to is a child not recognizing or picking up on the senses. So they might start seeking out that sense. A child who is hyposensitive to the vestibular system might be a child that likes to spin or rock. I see lots of families that say to me, when we sit down as a family, my child with ADHD is the child that's upside down on the couch or dangling from something. Often that is a trait of sensory seeking behaviour, but also proprioceptive seeking and vestibular seeking too. A child who is hyposensitive to interoception is a child who might be struggling to potty train. They might not necessarily be getting the signals that they need a wee or that they need to go to the toilet. So because they're not getting those signals, you might be finding that potty training's been difficult. Now, for some children, they can experience hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity in different environments and different situations that they find themselves in. And that's what we refer to as sensory integration. Sensory integration is the ability to use all of the 8 senses and work out in our environment what senses we need for the activity that we're doing and what senses we don't need that we can push away to not distract us. If you have sensory integration differences, what that sometimes leads to is difficulties knowing and understanding all the information in your environment. What that leads to is a child that might become overwhelmed in busy environments. I often have families that say when they go and do the food shop, it can be really difficult as soon as they step into the supermarket, when the noise volume goes up, the smells of the food, the people around them, they might see a change in their child's reaction or behaviour. Nurseries will often say when the room gets really busy, or they're much more comfortable in the outdoor environment than they are in the indoor environment. If you're seeing changes in behaviour or a child that becomes overwhelmed very quickly when there's lots happening in an environment, it's always helpful to reflect on sensory differences and just have a little bit of a think, is there something in this sensory environment that might be particularly overwhelming? Now, there's a great website called the Sensory Toolbox that might be worth having a little look at. But if you just type sensory integration differences into Google, there's lots of really useful articles. We've also got an article in the resources section of our early years website. So please have a little look on there because it'll give you further detail about that. Something that we can do to help sensory overload when the environment gets too much is just create some sensory safe spaces at home. These are just spaces that our little ones can go to just to desensitize. It might be a bedroom with low level lighting. You might want to close the curtains and create a nice calming space. It might be that you've got a teepee that you can use, a tent outside. I've got a family and they had a cupboard under the stairs. They took the door off the cupboard. It's a very small cupboard, but their 4-year-old loves to go in there, particularly at transition times where they were noticing he was finding things difficult. So he would use that space when he'd come in from nursery, because when he was coming in from nursery, he was becoming really overwhelmed. So he would just use this sensory space for 10 to 15 minutes, just to have a little bit of calm time in that transition from nursery to home. Now, you can have sensory spaces at home and inside, but you can also have sensory spaces outside. Nature is brilliant for all children, but for our children with ADHD, green spaces, access to kind of outdoor spaces can be really helpful too. So a sensory safe space for a child might be next to a tree outside, it might be in a tree house, it might be under some climbing equipment in the garden. But I suppose the purpose of the sensory space is just to have an opportunity to just have a little bit of downtime, to be able to manage all of the information that our environments are giving us. Now, these are just some useful sensory resources that families have told me about. There are also resources that lots of nurseries are using as well. You might have heard people recommending the likes of ear defenders. Ear defenders can be brilliant for noise sensitivity. So if your child is particularly sensitive to loud noises, or if you know you're going into an environment where it's going to be particularly noisy, ear defenders to protect the ears can be really helpful. Now, some children I work with, because they have sensitivity to sound and touch, they don't particularly like the ear defenders being on their ears. So for some children, I worked with one little boy and it was a cap for him. Another little girl liked to put her hood up. So when they'd go into a busy environment, you'd put a hood up, and that just worked as, I suppose, a resource that just prevented some of that noise that was coming in. Bright lights can sometimes be overwhelming. I worked with one mum and she used to say that her little girl, when they'd go into an environment where there was those bright strip lights, her little girl would start squinting or would put her head down. Visually, you could see she was becoming quite distressed, squinting her eyes. Mum gave her a pair of sunglasses, and with a pair of sunglasses on, her little one was able to manage those bright lights in that environment. And this little girl loves her sunglasses. Summer in particular, she needs them, but she'll be wearing them in the winter as well. And it really helps with that sensitivity to bright lights. Lots of our little ones chew. It's very, very common. It is very common. It's part of an early stage of child development. But we often see in our children with sensory sensitivities the need for oral stimulation. So chewing on clothes or chewing on things within the environment. Now, sometimes they chew on things that aren't safe. So access to things like chewable jewellery can be really helpful. Teething rings, anything that you know is safe for children to use, and make sure that if you're buying anything, just make sure that it's been tested and that it's safe to use. But things like teething rings can be great for that. And the jewellery, it's called, which is chewable jewellery. You can get bracelets and necklaces. They can be really helpful. Fidget resources can be really useful too. This is a cushion. I've taken a picture of this from one of the schools that I work with here in Liverpool. They've made these, and they're cushions, and on those cushions they've got zips, buttons, fasteners, and it's just great for those moments when you're at home where you might be watching the telly or you might be having tea, and it's an opportunity for the child to do some movements without being up on their feet. And fidget resources can be really helpful for that fine motor skill development. But also weighted resources. Weighted resources are wonderful for regulating the sensory kind of information, but they're also really calming. You can get access to weighted blankets. You can buy weighted blankets now. If you are using weighted resources, please make sure that they are the right weight for the size of your child. Also, if there are any respiratory difficulties or epilepsy present in your child, make sure that you're using weighted resources under adult supervision. But weighted resources can be brilliant because they can just help to facilitate a little bit of pressure, a small amount of pressure, which helps to regulate the limbic system, and then which then leads to help regulating emotions and stress and anxiety as well. Got lots of little ones using weighted resources in our nurseries, so it's worth having a little look at that too. So that's a little bit around sensory. To finish off, before our questions section, I just wanted to introduce you to executive functions as well. Now, I just wanted to introduce you to this idea because executive functions are what we see as a difficulty for our children with ADHD as they start to grow. Now, we've got 8 executive functions, but please don't worry. If your child is only 4, they're not expected to have all of these executive functions in place and developed yet. Our executive functions mature as a child matures. Now, because ADHD is a developmental delay, for children with ADHD at primary school level, executive functions are typically 2 to 3 years behind their peers. So it might be that you've got an older sibling with ADHD where you're thinking, actually, they're 8. But when I'm looking at this list of executive functions, they're potentially presenting as a 6-year-old. It's very, very common. This is why we don't focus on all 8 of them with our little ones, because they're still in the stage of executive function development. But if there's ADHD there as well, there's going to be a delay in how those executive functions are growing and embedding. So the 8 executive functions include impulse control. So impulse control is thinking before acting, stopping yourself from doing something before it's too late. Emotional control, being able to keep a check on your emotions, recognizing when you're getting stressed and managing that stress. Flexible thinking, adjusting and changing your thinking based on changes that are happening around you. So the ability to go, I'm doing this now, but mum's asked me to do this, so I need to stop that so I can move to the next activity that I'm being asked to do. People with weak executive functions can really struggle with flexible thinking. Working memory is remembering information on the go. So that's remembering verbal instructions, remembering a process or a routine that you've done before. Self-monitoring is sustaining attention, keeping on going, not giving up, being able to just keep on going and managing an activity. And then the final 3 are the 3 that kind of link together, which is planning and prioritizing, task initiation, and organization. So that's skills like organizing what you're going to play with, getting started with a play activity. I have lots of nurseries that say to me, for children that are presenting with possible ADHD, a trait that they might see is when it comes to tidy up time, the child struggles to know where to start, how to tidy up. Parents will say things to me like, in the home environment, learning skills of getting themselves dressed, So those independent skills have been really hard because their child is struggling to plan and prioritise what part of the outfit they need to put on first. Now, like I said to you, all children in the early years aren't expected to have all of these embedded. They're growing at this stage. The ones that I think we can focus on and pay attention to are these two, which is supports for impulse control and emotional self-regulation. Those two kind of come hand in hand, and supports for working memory. So I'm just going to share with you ways that we can support these 3 executive functions in the early years. Because if we can support these to begin with while our children are little, it then really helps to develop the foundations of our later developing executive functions. So to support our children with emotional self-control, we've got to teach them the skills. There's something we call co-regulation. And co-regulation, as adults, we co-regulate for our little ones. That's our job as adults. When our child is sad, our job is to pick them up, cuddle them and make them feel better, or offer a solution, offer them a problem, a solution to their problem. That's called co-regulation. As a child gets bigger, they are expected to develop independent self-regulation skills. So this is a child that needs us less and starts to develop their own way of managing their emotions. If you've got ADHD, that can be really tricky. And sometimes you have to be taught emotions. We call it the 3-step approach to emotional self-control. First step, we've got to teach our children the emotional language. We've got to help them understand the words. We can do that in lots of ways, reading books, watching programs that talk about emotions, but we can also label emotions when we see them. So when our child is happy, label it. You might use a sentence like, I think you're happy. I think you're sad. I think you're worried. I think you're angry. Just label those 4 core emotions to begin with. When you see them, say it. I think it was Roy Walker that said that, didn't he? If you see it, say it. Label your child's emotions. Label their siblings' emotions. Label nan and granddads, aunties, uncles, friends, neighbours. Just label, label, label as much as possible. Indulge children in emotional language, but just focus on those first 4. Happy, sad, worried and angry. Once you've done that for a period of time, you can then move on to step 2 of this programme, which is the recognising stage. Because what we now need to do is support our children to understand how those emotions react in their bodies. So now you label the emotion and the physical response. So you might say to your child, I think you're happy because you've got a big smile on your face. I think you're sad because you're crying. I think you're worried because you're biting your bottom lip. Now you continue to label the emotion and the feeling. And once you've done that for a period of time, you then introduce a regulation strategy for them. So if your child is getting physical when they get angry, a regulation strategy would be something that gets that fuzzy physical feeling out. So you might say to a child, I think you're angry because you're clenching your fists. Let's go and get a resistance band and pull. Or I think you're sad because you're crying. Let's do some breathing exercises. Now, the regulation strategy will be based on what you're seeing. So if your child's quite physical, they will need a strategy to get that physical feeling out. And that's your heavy weighted things, that's your resistance activities. That might be a big run outside or a go on the trampoline. If your child's more emotional, or if your child is struggling, you might see changes in their breathing or excessive speech. They might benefit from some breathing exercises. And there's some wonderful exercises on YouTube. Go Noodle is great. If your child's at school, they've probably seen it. Cosmic Kids Yoga is wonderful as well. There's also a great app on an iPad called Stop, Breathe and Think Kids. And all of those YouTube clips or those apps can help to encourage some of those skills in our little ones. To support impulse control, now this can be really hard in our little ones. And it's hard because they're meant to be impulsive because of their developing age and stage. But this is a coaching strategy that we use. It's called Stop, Think and Do. And you can use this in every situation. If you're getting out the car, before we get out, let's stop. Let's think about what we need to do and then let's do it. Before we have our breakfast, let's stop. Let's think about how we're going to eat this and then let's do it. You just use that as a verbal coaching strategy. What you're doing is you're coaching that slowing down of thinking. If we stop first, we think about what we're doing, then we complete the action. We can start with this coaching strategy as young as 3, and we can just do it in our everyday conversations, going out into the garden, going to the shops. Let's just stop, let's think, and then let's complete the action or complete the job. And then finally, to support working memory, this is the inattentive bit of ADHD. If we think back to when we looked at the brain and inattention, it's slow processing of information. Children with ADHD really benefit from seeing things rather than hearing them, because when they can see it, it's much more concrete. So if I can see what my day looks like on a visual timetable, I understand what's happening and I understand the process of the day. That helps me with my flexible thinking as well. Now we're next boards. Now we're doing this, next we're going to be doing that. Visualizing it for a child will help them to make sense of it. Externalizing time, using sand timers. Bath time can often be a real difficult time for our children because of all sorts of sensory difficulties. It might be that you put them in the bath and you use a sand timer. I want you to be in the bath for 5 minutes. When the sand's run out, that's when we're getting out of the bath. Or transitions, signalling a transition. So playing outside and then having to come in for tea. I'm going to put the sand timer on and I'm going to show you how long you've got before you've got to make that transition back into the house. If you can externalize information as much as possible, it really helps with the processing of information. We're really lucky, we've got phones now, so taking photos of common places that you go and using those images as backup to your language will be really helpful. So if you're going to do the Asda shop, take a picture of Asda, we're going to Asda. If you go in the park, have a picture of the park, we're going to the park. If you go into an auntie's house, we're going to auntie's house. So use the language, because it's really important that they're hearing the words, but back language up with pictures as well. And that could just really help with the processing speed and processing time that our little ones need in order to understand instructions and sustain attention. So I hope that was helpful. A bit of a whistle-stop tour of ADHD in the early years. And I hope some of the resources on our website will be helpful reading for you. I just wanted to make sure that for these last kind of 10 minutes, we've got an opportunity for some questions. So I'll wait for Molly to come back and see what questions have come in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emma. We've had lots of great questions coming in, so we'll just try and get through as many as we can. First one is, how do I get support from school when a child is masking? My child is 6 and is in year 1. I've had concerns for years now, but the schools say that they have none.
The difficulty is often we need to have schools to see the presenting behaviours within the school environment in order to get some of those supports in place. We've got a really good book on our website. It's called Supporting ADHD in Education. If you type that into the search box on our website and pass it on to school, what we tend to find in some instances is ADHD, we have an understanding of ADHD, but when we learn a little bit more about it, we recognise ADHD in a different way. Unfortunately, as part of teacher training, not everybody gets, as part of their training, access to training around ADHD. So sometimes just passing materials on to help people to understand what ADHD looks like can be really helpful. So it might be that if you pass on a booklet with some further information. We've also done some webinars with Witherslack, which are free for teachers to help them to understand ADHD a little bit more. So that can be useful. If you're wanting them to make a referral to a referral pathway and they're not doing that, you can go directly to your GP. Every area is different and the referral pathways are different in every area. But if you feel that you would like to go to the GP, then you are able to do that as well.
Great, thank you. Next one is, I joined for help for my 8-year-old daughter, but my 2-year-old shows many symptoms as well. I just thought she was a normal 2-year-old, albeit different to my other children. Can it be diagnosed this young, as I didn't see a point to ask until she was older?
It's very little. That's a very little. I think what we know, neurodevelopmental conditions are genetic, so they often run in families. So a lot of our work, we often when we work with families, one of the things that we do is look for genetic links. So if there is a sibling or a cousin or a parent or anybody within the family with a neurodevelopmental condition, that's often an alert for us to recognise that it is highly genetic. If you're seeing those traits, and if your little one is in nursery or has access to a health visitor, there's no harm to have those initial conversations to begin with. The difficulty is they're only little. So there might be a reluctance to put you on a referral pathway or anything like that at this point in time because of the age. But I don't think there's any harm in having it in the back of your mind, especially if there's an older sibling with the condition. It's often common that we see it as a link through siblings. So having those early conversations can be helpful.
Great, thank you. Next one is, what about a child who constantly needs the iPad and watches cartoons, the same cartoon over and over, also stimming while watching TV? Is that only autism, or is the ADHD aspects in there too?
Yeah, this is where it's difficult. ADHD and autism, there's something called co-occurrence, and co-occurrence is really common across neurodevelopmental conditions. And co-occurrence is where there is often more than one presenting condition. So I work with lots of children with co-occurring ADHD and autism, or co-occurring ADHD and dyslexia. So sometimes it's not easy to define. For ADHD, we refer to something called hyperfocus. And hyperfocus is the ability to focus on something for a long period of time if you're motivated by it and if you really enjoy it. That helps to regulate dopamine. So some children that I meet will hyperfocus on programs on the telly, on their favorite episode of their favorite cartoon on the iPad. That can be common in ADHD. It can also be common in the autistic spectrum. Often it's referred to as intense interests or repetitive patterns of behavior. The difficulty is unpicking what the difference between the two. But we can see those sorts of traits in both ADHD and autism. But I suppose it's also important to hold in mind it could be both. It could be a co-occurrence of ADHD and autism as well. And that's where your assessments are really important.
Thanks, Emma. This one's quite a long one, but it's a good one. So my son is 7 years old. He has a diagnosis of autism and ADHD. However, as per his MD team, it's the ADHD that's holding him back. He's very bright, but can only focus on special interest at the moment, which is coding and maths. His team wanting him to begin prescription drugs, but I refuse this. He's now homeschooled and he's thriving at his own pace. We do a morning cycle ride to help him focus, but after lunchtime we lose his focus and he becomes very impulsive, hitting his little brother, but then being very sad, but then also repeating it. Any suggestions on how to help him in a natural way? Thank you.
Great question. I think this is what we sometimes see. By the time they get to the afternoon, they're tired. So it's like all of us, isn't it? When we're tired, some of our skills in regulating our emotions and regulating our behaviours are impacted by the fact that we're tired. I think for lots of children that I meet, regulation strategies with a focus on relaxation and heavy weight can be really helpful. What you might want to do is after lunchtime, when you start to see that dip, is do some sensory-based activities with him with a focus on weight. So it might be that I've got one family, they've got a sleeping bag, their little boy goes into the sleeping bag and they roll him up, and they call it the sausage roll. They roll him up so it's kind of squeezes him a little bit, and then they just do some heavy weight pressure on him to help him just regulate the body a little bit, which helps him to then manage some of those behaviours as well. I think when it comes to impulsivity, because it's very much in the moment, you stop, think and do strategy can be really helpful to kind of manage the impulsive behaviours. But reflecting afterwards can be really helpful too. So we've got a strategy that we use, and it's called the let's shine a light on what happened. So when there's been an impulsive situation, it's about looking at what happened and then reflecting on what we can do differently next time. You might also want to think about those emotional regulation strategies too. It might be, and I'm often talking about the need for proactive strategies rather than reactive. Proactive strategies are where we have consistent things that we do in order to keep a child regulated. So it might be that he benefits throughout the day from some proactive sensory-based activities to help him keep calm for when it gets into the afternoon. It might be that he would benefit from some proactive work around some of that impulse control, some of the resistance activities. Might be I've worked with one little boy, and on the hour, every hour in school, he goes out and he does some resistance activities, really pulling, climbing up ropes. And what they found is with that proactive approach on the hour, every hour, they see less of the impulsive behavioural responses in the afternoon when he's tired. So that might be helpful. Conscious that was a big answer.